good evening. Welcome to this event, and first of all, thank you very much to Mary Jack and Deloitte for hosting this event together with us. We know that Deloitte has a very strong interest in education policy, which is why we asked you to sponsor this event tonight, and we're very grateful that you're actually hosting this here with us in Auckland tonight. I would also like to thank the New Zealand Education and Scholarship Trust, who've been very supportive of this whole project from the beginning. And last but very definitely not least, I would like to thank the authors of tonight's publication, which we're going to launch, Rose Patterson and John Morris, for their contribution over the last months in putting this report together. I should explain that when the initiative was founded about 1.5 years ago, the board and the membership came together and discussed which topics should be covered as a priority for the new organization. And a few topics really were non-negotiable. Everybody thought, for example, that we need to do something about the housing market and housing affordability. Everybody thought we have to do something to keep the New Zealand economy open to foreign direct investment. And equally strongly, we had support for education reform and a better education system. And we're very proud to release the first report coming out of this research stream tonight. Really, this research was triggered partly by a remark from the Secretary to the Treasury, Gabriel McClough, who remarked last year that he thought the biggest issue, long-term issue for the New Zealand economy was the quality of its teachers. Now we can discuss whether that's really the biggest issue for the New Zealand economy, but we agreed that it's certainly one of the key components of future economic success to get the right teachers for New Zealand's education system. And so we started this research with John Morris, and we're really, really pleased with the progress that he has made together with Rose Patterson in putting this publication together. Now I should warn you, tonight you're going to hear from John about the research we have done on the quality of the New Zealand education system and the quality of the teachers working within that system, but you're not going to get any other answers from us, because this is just the first report in a trilogy of reports. We are producing a trilogy of reports, and the first report is looking at the status of the domestic education system. The second report, to be launched in early December, will look at international experiences, and our research team have visited Australia, Singapore, Germany, Finland, Canada, and the UK to come up with answers to how other countries are dealing with essentially the same challenges to their education systems. And finally, after we've done our research, both domestically and internationally, we will present you with our recommendations for policy reform. It may seem a bit old-fashioned, but we first do the research before we actually give you any policy recommendations. So, with that introduction, I would like to introduce you to the speaker tonight, John Morris. Now, John has served as headmaster of Auckland Grammar School for 20 years until 2012. He was awarded a Wolf Fisher Fellowship for Outstanding Educational Leadership in 1999. And this year he was awarded Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit in the New Year's Honours List for services to education. He recently served on the Ministerial Review for the New Zealand Teachers' Council and is on the Implementation Board for Partnership Schools. John is also on the board of Education New Zealand and is a Commissioner for the Tertiary Education Commission. His work introducing the Cambridge International Examinations to New Zealand has seen him present in Asia and the Middle East on leadership in education. So without further ado, I hand you over to John Morris.
Well, good evening, or good afternoon, really, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to speak this evening about world-class education. And in the research, as you can see over there, it's quite a big book. There's a lot more than 20 things we learnt. But what we have done is to synthesize it down a little bit to what I think are 20 important things from the research that might be useful for us all to have a look at. So, first of all, starting off with our first slide, and it's working, whoops. First of all, and of course this will have some debate, but New Zealand primary school students are not world class. That is, if you judge it on international benchmarking tests. And like it or lump it, that's the way that education systems around the world are judged these days. So we have TIMSS, which is the Trends in International Maths and Science Study, PIRLS, the Progress in International Reading and Literacy, and PISA, of course, for the secondary school sector, Program for International Student Assessment. So based on those three tests, or based on the first two tests, which are primary school ones, we can say that New Zealand primary school students are not world class. For example, in mathematics, if you have a look at the stats there, you'll see that we were below the international mean, placed 32nd in the world, and on a par with Croatia, Romania and Poland. Not where we want to be. Australia, just to have a look across the ditch, 19th, and Singapore first in that particular category. And maths has been a problem. You would have seen stuff in the Herald over the last few months about maths teaching, maths results and so on. And there's other things we can talk about later on about the mathematics in the primary school. In the science testing, we were placed about the same, 31st in the world, on a par with Kazakhstan and Norway. I'm not sure that's where we want to be either. And Australia slightly ahead on the 25th, Korea first. And the literacy test in Pearls, Year 5 students placed 23rd, on a par with Slovak Republic, Slovenia and Bulgaria. Australia 27th, Hong Kong first. Now there's lots of discussion points you could make about those, but perhaps one thing that stands out, if you look at all those countries, or should I say city-states, apart from Korea that came first, East Asia. Very, very important point to make. And whether or not we have a look at those, which we will do in our second publication, and see whether it's worth mimicking that or picking up any good ideas from those particular countries. So Singapore, city-state, Hong Kong, city-state, Korea, of course, a country, and first in the world in that. So in the primary school sector, things aren't looking too hot. The interesting thing is that you may remember it before Leslie Longstone finally resigned as Secretary of Education. She was quoted as saying that we don't have a world-class education system. John Minto argued very strongly against that, as did NZEI, present at the time. But when you look at the statistics, and I know there's more, as a teacher of 40 years, I know there's more to education than just looking at examination results or test results. But those are pretty damning and pretty worrying when you look at that situation. Now, secondary school students. Again, looking just at the bare stats, we are very internationally competitive. Our 15-year-olds in PISA performed well above the international mean. 7th in reading, 13th in maths, 7th in science. Compare Australia, again, roughly around about the same, and look at the top in the world, Shanghai, Eastern Asia. Again, a city-state. We're not looking at China, we're looking at Shanghai here. So it's slightly different there. So in all of that, you've got to say New Zealand ranks very, very highly in the secondary school sector. You think, well, why a difference from so poorly in the primary sector and an increase in improvement in the secondary? So that's something that we need to perhaps fathom out, and you might have some ideas on that later on as well. But as always, looking at stats, it's not that simple. You can drill down and find all sorts of things. And third point we learned was that New Zealand has a vast disparity. Again, not a surprise. That's not unknown. But it is a fact that our top students are brilliant. Our top students will compete with the best in the world. No doubt about that. However, our lower performing students are a real worry. In reading, maths and science, especially huge disparity by ethnicity. So if you actually combine all your PISA results together, which can be done and is done by OECD, you find that if you take New Zealand Europeans, we are second in the world. If you take New Zealand Maori, we're 33rd. If you take New Zealand Pacifica, they're in the mid-40s. So a huge disparity, ethnicity in New Zealand. In fact, New Zealand, as mentioned on the slide, has one of the widest gaps in educational performance in the OECD. John Hattie's comments, top 80% are very competitive, bottom 20% falling backwards like no other country in the Western world. Only one country in the OECD group, plus the extras, is 30 odd in the OECD, and there's about 65 altogether are tested in these tests. There's only one country that has a bigger disparity between top and bottom than New Zealand. And that is, of course, a major concern for us. It's interesting that throughout the 20th century, in fact, throughout the ages, we've always tried to improve student achievement. Education has always been important. The interesting thing from our research was that the 20th century reform that was started and finished by the end of the century, of course, the measures failed miserably. If you look at the various movements, progressivism of the 60s and 70s, where open classrooms, new maths, different ways of learning to read and so on, the open classrooms didn't give any big increase or improvement in student achievement. School effectiveness movement, a swing if you like, more to the right, very limited improvement. And the global education reform movement, which they now call GERM, the late 20th century, also very limited improvement in the student achievement. Dylan William, who is a professor at the University of London, great quote, "Depressing reality, net effect of the vast majority of reform measures on student achievement has been close to, if not actually, zero." And there's a reason for that. All these reform measures looked at structural things, organisational things, looked at curriculum, looked at assessment, looked at financing, and so on, governance, all these various changes. but they missed out on one thing. And our argument, the thing that we picked up from our research, is that we're looking in the wrong places for the answers. Again, to quote William, education reforms of the late 20th century were largely unsuccessful because they failed to address head-on the dominant variable in the education system, teacher quality. And nobody quite likes to accept that. You know, teaching's very collegial, and we all think we're great teachers. In my 40 years, 24 years as a head, I don't think I've come across anybody who thinks we're a bad teacher. I seriously haven't. We all think we're doing a great job. But if you look at all the research from OECD and elsewhere, there is a real variability in teacher quality around. And as the head of a school for 20 odd years, you see that. You see that. Not everybody is a wonderful teacher. And these reform measures didn't even look at teachers. They looked beyond teachers. They looked at the structural, the organisational, but they didn't look at teachers. And maybe if they had, there would be some improvement in student achievement as a consequence of that. So we're looking in the wrong places. Sixth thing, without a shadow of a doubt, it's the teacher. It's the teacher that matters. Steve Denham, who writes, is a professor at the University of Melbourne. We know two important things about teaching and learning. First is the quality of the classroom teacher is a major in-school influence on student learning. That's the John Hattie information where his meta-analysis that he did. 30% of the impact on student achievement comes from the teacher. 50% from what the boy or girl would bring to school, intellectual capacity, the family background, address, whatever, but 30% comes from the teacher. The second fact is that teacher quality varies widely. And no matter how much research you do, and we could have gone on researching this forever and a day, that is a common theme that comes through. That there's not everybody is a great teacher, no matter what they might think. So, more can be done to improve education by improving the effectiveness of teachers than by any other single factor. Okay, so all the various things that we've talked about before, the curriculum change, assessment change, different financing arrangements, all those put to one side, get the teaching right. You know, the biggest equity issue in education is having a quality teacher in every classroom. That's the biggest equity issue. And the McKinsey report in 2007, which, it was a seminal report, really got so much publicity, probably too much maybe, but a really pithy quote: the quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. No matter what you say, that's the bottom line. Okay, cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. You could have the most wonderful buildings in your school, but if you've got lousy teachers, you've got a lousy school. Simple and straightforward as that. And again, just to quote John Hattie, it's what teachers know, what teachers do, and what they care about that is most powerful in influencing student achievement. So our whole focus really has been looking at that sort of situation. And you think that if teaching was that important, it'd be pretty easy to pick out what makes or what constitutes a quality teacher. We found that was not actually that easy, you know. Teaching, according to Jeff Masters again from the University of Melbourne, is an art, not a science. And there are no single best ways of teaching. I think that's a fair claim. But the Economist also came out, no agreed list of traits to define or identify a teacher. Now, Rose and I went through so many different groups. We looked at ERO, we looked at Ofsted, we looked at OECD, American trade union movements with all their lists. PBTA have got their list. There's a whole list of it and tick them off, and we try and synthesize them all around. But there is also, it's difficult, there are different interpretations and opinions about that. But despite that, we think that regardless, recognising effective teaching is still vital, still really, really important. And the one that we quite liked was the Ofsted one, which is the inspection agency in the UK. And they had a short list, which is good for a change. But these are what they think makes a quality teacher. And I think when you're trying to get people, the best and the brightest, into teaching, worthwhile remembering these things. First of all, exceptionally strong subject knowledge. You've got to know what you're talking about. You've got to know what you're talking about. And I'm sort of digressing a little bit, but if you go back to the primary school situation, our research found that in teaching of maths in primary school, there are too many maths avoiders. Teachers that don't like maths. Maybe you drop maths at the end of the fifth form, you never pick it up again, but because they're generalists, they've got to teach it, and yet they don't teach it particularly well. So you know what you're talking about. 2, good interaction with students. You've got to get, you've got to have that good interrelationship with the people that you're teaching. Very important, communication skills. You need to challenge them to extend their thinking And to challenge students, you need to know something. You need to know what's going on. So again, it's subject knowledge, ability to inspire students, and high expectations. Very easy to set the bar down here, and everybody reaches it. We want to set the bar up here and really make people work hard for that. So in a way, that Ofsted is a sort of a combination of a whole lot of things that we came across. McKinsey's approached it slightly differently. When they were doing their seminal study, they looked at, instead of looking at the outcomes in a classroom, they said, well, let's have a look at the teachers prior to them being accepted into teaching or teacher trainees, and see if they had the skills that could actually give them a disposition to teach and to teach well. So when they did their testing, they found that the most high-performing systems looked at the four things. A high level of literacy and numeracy, again, which ties into what Ofsted was saying. Strong interpersonal communication skills, a willingness to learn. You know, that teachers have to think, well, you know, I don't know everything, and the willingness to learn. I mean, often you think, you know, so I see young teachers go into a classroom, kids misbehave, and they blame the kids instead of saying, looking in the mirror and saying, what did I do wrong there? Is there something that I can learn from this situation? You know, did I arrive late? Wasn't I well prepared? Did I have a late night the night before? All those sorts of things that impact on how well you perform, how well you feel in a classroom situation. So a willingness to learn is an important fact, and a motivation to teach. That's a big one, because you get people who have got BAs and think, well, what else can I do? In fact, there's a lot of things you can do these days, but they still think, well, I think we'll go teaching because, you know, it's perceived as, you know, good holidays, easy job, you know, decent pay, that sort of stuff. Well, which is garbage, as we'll see when we come on to that. But that motivation to teach is really, really an important one. Again, you think that because teaching is so important and quality teachers are important, that we'd know how good our teachers were. However, it's a little bit tricky finding out how good our teachers are. New Zealand's devolved system means that it's entirely up to individual schools to develop methods for appraising and evaluating a teacher's performance, and also what that school does with that facts and figures. Do they follow up? Do they link it to anything like professional development? Or do they just leave it? And I think that our research also pointed out there's a general reticence in New Zealand to measure the impact of teaching on student learning. You know, that brings up the spectre of performance pay, which I'll talk briefly about later on. You know, that's always been an issue. Should we reward excellence or should we not, you know? It's a really, really big thing there. Do we measure? Some schools do measure. Some schools do go through and say, well, this teacher achieved these sorts of results in NCA level 3 or whatever it is, but a lot don't. And data collection is becoming a very, very important part of this sort of assessment nowadays. What we can say is the New Zealand cohort is well qualified. 86%, and this is primary and secondary, teachers have a bachelor's degree. In the secondary sector, 90% have a bachelor's degree, 8% have either a master's or a PhD. Fantastic numbers. Those are very good numbers. So we're a highly qualified workforce at the moment. Now, if I said to you guys here, who do you think is responsible for quality teaching in New Zealand and for giving you know, a professional face to teaching? And I'm guessing that probably a lot of you would say, well, PBTA or NZEI. In fact, the body that's responsible for teaching, quality teaching in New Zealand is, I think, quite ineffectual. New Zealand Teachers Council is actually the body charged by legislation and the Education Act to provide professional leadership in teaching, enhance the status of teaching, and contribute to high quality teaching and learning environment. And I was invited to be part of the NZTC Ministerial Review last year, and which I found incredibly interesting, but also very demanding of time and effort in terms of interviewing so many people about this. But there's absolutely no doubt that what came out of this was that the Teachers' Council has been largely ineffectual in its 10 years of operation. It hasn't shown any meaningful leadership to the profession, and it's failed to offer any policy initiatives to improve the quality of teaching. I can't think of any. And if only in the last 2 years that they started putting out a newsletter on the web, which I think most teachers probably don't even read. In other words, the links between the Teachers' Council and teachers per se is almost nil. And yet they're the body responsible for quality teaching in New Zealand. On their side, there are some factors that do limit their ability to make a difference. One is that they are a crown entity, and so therefore they need to be responsive to what the Minister may want to be done. So in that way, that's a limitation. The second limitation, which I haven't put on the slide, but which is a major one in my mind, is the structure of the governance of the Teachers' Council. I think the governance arrangement definite change in the new Teachers' Council that will be starting, I suppose, in the next 12 months. And whatever happens, the revamped Teachers' Council, if they want to be, if the Minister wants, and the Minister does want, a professional voice for teachers, and a professional organisation for teachers, then the revamped NZTC must create this community of teachers and develop that engagement with the profession which has been lacking. And particularly, I think, with the secondary profession. I think there may be a closer link to primary, but certainly not to the secondary. And we need someone to lead that debate on education, not just sit there in Wellington and get all the bits and pieces and do registration. Because at the moment, if you said, who does registration in New Zealand? Obviously they do, but that's all they do. You know, what else do they do? What other things? And there are a few bits and pieces. They've done quite good stuff on induction and mentoring programs and things like that. But you wouldn't know that unless you were part and parcel of that particular program. And the biggest one, which I'll talk about shortly, is lifting the status of the profession. Because at the moment, I think the status of the profession is a pretty low ebb. Unions. Everybody's got an opinion about unions. My research, and I looked quite comprehensively both here and overseas about this, and the thing that struck me was that the unions are in a bit of a difficult situation because they've got so many conflicting missions which do impact on their actual operation. So naturally, and quite rightly, they promote and protect members' interests. They do get involved in professional debate in a big way. They get more publicity on debate of education matters than do the New Zealand Teachers' Council, which shouldn't necessarily be the case. But they've also more recently got involved in social justice issues, and equity and environmental things, which takes their attention away a little bit from that. And then the real reason they were set up in the first place, I guess, for meat and potatoes bargaining. You know, so I mean, those are four things that they've got to do. And I think from in fact, I know from our research that the unions have got to get a bit more involved in terms of being positive about some of the changes that are being mooted. So, first reaction of most of these of the unions to any change, any reform ideas, tends to be negative. You know, you look through the paper, particularly the national government, maybe a bit more similar to a Labour government, but certainly a national government, first reaction tends to be negative. I can't think of any positive feedback that you've had from the union regarding anything. I know we've had some tricky issues, NCA, national standards, charter schools, all that sort of stuff. But hey, let's think a little bit about them before we come forward and just say, terrible, it's not going to work, and so on. So my belief here is that for any progress in New Zealand education, whether it's reform or strength of the profession, it's vital to engage with the union movement. So the union movement have got to be involved somehow or other will be no change. UNESCO, and I have to say this was research done in association with the International Labour Organisation, so you can take that as you want. But I think it's a valid point. Without full involvement of teachers in their organisations in key aspects of educational objectives and policies, education systems cannot hope to achieve quality education for all. In other words, we've got to get together on this. Too often it's divisive, you know, rather than getting together and trying to work out something that will work and be positive. Now, to get that engagement between government and unions, unions may have to modify their current modus operandi, and I think that won't be too bad a thing if it's going to lead to great things later on. Challenge for us, and I think we are in this way still quite an immature society compared to what's happening overseas in education reform. We need a more mature situation in which teacher unions are seen as part of the solution and the education reform process rather than as defenders of the status quo and divisive in their approach to reform. At the moment, PTA particularly I don't think wants any change because they are the face of secondary school teaching. They shouldn't be. Teachers' council should be. But they are at the moment, so why would they want change? And I think that's something that we've got to think a little bit about, how we overcome that sort of issue and divisiveness and get together on it. To me, one of the biggest issues is to do with the status of the New Zealand teaching profession. So our 11th thing we learned was to do with the fact that the status of the profession needs a major lift. Kane and Mallon, the quote there, was a study done by them for NZCR and the Ministry of Education in 2006. And quote is an interesting one. This is it's a perception study. And they said by its very nature, teaching struggles to be conceived of as a high status job. It's work with young people, largely feminised workforce, perceived low academic rigor is training, relatively limited salary, all interpreted as barriers to high status. And I'm sure you can argue with a lot of that. It's a real major to get the status of the profession to a point where people want to go teaching, the right people want to go teaching. Hall and Langton followed on that study, and they ranked teaching as the same level, and nothing against these occupations and journalists here tonight, so no, as accountants, nurses, journalists and actors. And just last week, GEMS, which is an organisation with a lot of international schools in Asia and also Middle East, did some research on New Zealand teaching as well. Well, in fact, I'm teaching generally in New Zealand one of their case studies. And in their study, we were equated with social work and nursing. And there's nothing wrong with that, very worthy occupations. But if you want to get the best and the brightest into teaching as opposed to engineering and law and medicine, then we're going to have to do something about it. So the status of the profession is not high. And some reasons, and I think in some ways teachers, we ourselves, we're sort of complicit in lowering the status a little bit because, you know, we moan to the kids and we moan at dinner parties and we moan to our colleagues about things. But these are some factors that Kane and Mallon found contributing to all this dissatisfaction. Job overload. OECD did a study on New Zealand in 2010, and they said that the doability of the job in New Zealand was not good. And that's why, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is their words sort of thing, but that we weren't getting the right people into teaching in New Zealand because the doability of the job was too difficult. Inadequate rewards. A feeling of being undervalued, you know. Insufficient support from on top, that is from the principals in their schools, insufficient support. Constant change without consultation, you know, they're tired, debilitated by it. Deteriorating behaviour of students, unreal expectations by parents. Media blames teachers for a myriad of things going wrong, and public hold teachers responsible for almost every social problem. So all those things add up to a situation which is not great to attracting really top people into the profession. We then went and had a look at you know, the sort of the process, like the journey of getting into teaching. And the first thing, of course, is getting into a teacher training program. And we believe that it's far too easy to get into a teacher training program. So if you want to go into primary school, you've got level 3 and UE, then you just about just walk into it. Not necessarily checking whether or not they've got the disposition to be a great teacher. So the feedback that we got from our research, from talking to people and from our research as well, was that primary school teaching entry into it is not sufficiently challenging to encourage academically inclined young people into the profession. And even at secondary school level, Kane and Mallon found entry standards that were insufficiently rigorous and that younger student teachers lacked the professional attitudes and the commitment required in today's classrooms. That's disposition to teach. It's lacking, it's not there. Nothing was done to check that out. So too easy to get into a teacher training program, we've got to make it more challenging. And if you're looking a little bit at overseas stuff, high achieving systems, which again we know, but it's worth repeating, they all begin the screening process at the entry to initial teacher education with rigorous checks designed to assess teaching potential and also only accept trainees from the top 30% of the graduating class. Now, you know, we don't do that. I've got actual stats on Australia. I can't get them on New Zealand, but if we sort of fairly akin to that, basically in Australia at the moment they're accepting people into teacher training. They have a 100% range. It's called ATAR, and it's just say 100% thing. They're taking people to teaching between 45 and 65. So in other words, you get below average and slightly above average who are entering teaching in Australia at the moment. That is the average. Only one university takes high, that's Melbourne, and they're looking at 90% plus in their program. But all the rest are much lower than that. That 30% of the graduating class, the top 30%, you can quote Finland, Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea. And where those countries are all in the top 5 in terms of all the results of PISA. So top 30%. Now we all know that teacher education is important, but what sort of teacher education? And you know, as a general rule, teachers when they go into these, I mean there's a general sort of family of things you do. You do pedagogy, sort of how to teach, classroom management, subject content, and then you practice on kids' school practicums. That's what you do. So university provides the theory, the methods and the skills. Schools provide the setting. So that's a general thing that happens normally. However, there's little agreement really on the nature of ITE, and concerns about the quality of teacher preparation are mirrored worldwide. John Hattie has long been a critic of teacher education, even though he was involved in teacher education himself. He's still a critic of it. And his quote there is from an unpublished paper he's only just written this year. I was lucky enough to get hold of it a couple of weeks ago. But long-standing and frequent criticism indicates that these models of teacher education, what's happening now, have little influence on the practices of teacher candidates. And why bother? Why bother? And that was his argument. At the University of Melbourne at the moment where he is, they're going into a brand new format of teacher training, which is called clinical practice, which I go into a little bit in the report. I'm not going to go into it now, but it's an advance on what's been done in the past. And then if you look at Arthur Levine, who's written a lot in the States, teacher education is a Dodge City of the education world. Like the Wild West, it's unruly and chaotic. And, in the States, that is absolutely true. But it's worthwhile noting that in New Zealand, you've got 28 organisations accredited to provide teacher education. Now, it's ridiculous in a country our size. 28 organisations accredited, and no sort of consensus on quality or what you're doing. It's all different. Everything is different. And so teacher training in Singapore, by the way, is one organisation does all the teacher training. In Finland, there are 8, but they're all universities. It's quite constrained, and we've got 28 in a country our size. It just makes no sense whatsoever. In teacher training, I think the basic disagreement is whether IT should provide more time in schools or more time on theory of teaching. That's always been a debate, even when I was at Teachers College in the 1970s. But at Grammar, we would have 30 or 40 trainees through a year, and I always briefed them before and also afterwards. And I said, look, what's the situation with your program? So this is purely anecdotal, but it's also backed up by research. The vast majority of trainees describe their practical experiences as the most valuable of their program. Particularly, and this is the quid pro quo, it's got to be carefully planned, got to be interwoven with coursework, it's got to be undertaken with highly effective teachers, and also carefully supervised. Now at the moment, University of Auckland, AUT, they have around about 14 weeks in classrooms in schools. OECD recommends a minimum of 20 weeks. The only one that does more than that is the New Zealand Graduate College down in Christchurch, where they're virtually full-time in schools. And they have a competency-based system, which I think is a really good system, is that when you've proven that you're good enough to teach, then you go out and you do some teaching, you finish, and you go and you get your certificate. It could be up to 6 months. And if you haven't reached that after 12 months, then you stick around until you do. Whereas it tends to be that you do 12 months post-grad and you get it and away you go. You're teaching, you know what you're doing. Interestingly, that 57%, the third bullet point there, that's not a particularly positive figure. Only 57% of school leaders satisfied with the quality of ITE graduates that they were employing. So there are answers and solutions here, and as Oliver said, we're not really going to give you these yet. We're going to make you wait a little bit until we do the third book. But I think it's worthwhile saying that there does need, the 14th thing we learned, there does need to be alternative routes into teaching, not just the traditional one that we've had forever and a day. And these routes are becoming more and more popular overseas and are proving successful. So if you look in, for example, even the UK, you've got Teach First UK, which I'll talk a little bit in a minute, but also you've got SCIT and you've got GTP, which are all basically in-school courses. Now, the University of Auckland recently introduced the Teach First program here in New Zealand as an alternative to the regular graduate program. And it's modelled on the UK one. It allows top graduates to go straight into teaching after a short intensive orientation. Now, I know that PBTA weren't that keen on that, but they did come round to the party, if I'm right on that, and did say, well, no, we'll give it a shot. Because I was part of the interview, I was interviewed on that a couple of years ago, and PBTA were involved, and I must say I was pleased that they saw beyond what the situation was normally and did support the Teach First model. Just a quote there from Fenton Whelan, who's written a nice little book. It's out of print now, but if you can ever get it, it's a really good book. Thanks to, I think I got that through Sean and Deborah. But the UK Ofsted rated Teach First graduates among the best teachers produced by any teacher training route. just a quote, that was the UK experience of that. So alternative routes into teaching. I mean, the issue, if you think a little bit about it, if you were, say, 35 and you wanted to go to teaching as a second career, you'd have to lose a year's pay. You'd also pay for your course, and at the end of it, you've got no guarantee of a job. You know, why would you do that? If you really want to do that, why would you do that? You'd have to be absolutely, totally committed. Now, just following that journey through, and I'll work through these next two slides quite quickly. Induction and mentoring, which is mandatory, and also teacher appraisal, which is mandatory, but again, not done particularly well in New Zealand. We have an obligation as schools to make sure that every teacher, new teacher coming in, gets a good induction and a good mentoring program. Research would show you that quality programs mean that the trainee teachers or the beginning teachers get greater satisfaction and greater commitment to the job if they do that. So that's really, really important. I think the interesting point about the induction there is that primary schools do it better, and that's partly, I think, because NZTC did put out quite a good mentoring program for primary schools. Secondary schools are a little bit more blasé about this. 63% of programs, according to Marie Cameron's research, were minimal or just ad hoc approaches to fix specific problems, so classroom management or whatever. I think, to me, the critical thing that comes out of that third bullet point is that you need a bit more than just a program of mentoring as well. The whole school should really have that culture of support for beginning teachers, not just bits and pieces of it. And teacher appraisal, well, I don't think anybody likes doing appraisal. Mr. Blythe's in charge of appraisal at Grammar. There's 165 teachers there. It's a hard job to do. And again, it's mandatory. Once a year, you've got to do this. OECD did a specific review of New Zealand appraisal in 2010. They said the biggest weakness, no external input. So it's who do you want to appraise this year? Well, I'll choose him because he's my mate or whatever. That sort of can happen in schools. Whereas, to do it properly, to make it worthwhile, you need more external input, which of course costs money and time and effort, which is difficult when you've got big schools. But the other thing was the attestation process, which, as a head, I was responsible for. So I've got to attest that a beginning teacher after 2 years is absolutely qualified to go on, and also even a teacher of 10 years who might have lost the plot and not particularly doing well, I have to attest every 3 years for registration that they're actually good enough. And I don't think we do that pretty well. I don't think we do well at all. It's not sufficient to deal with that underperformance of teachers. And that was a second major weakness that OECD found. Kane and Mallon, going back to their research in New Zealand directly in 2006, no link was ever found between appraisal and professional development, and appraisal was often ad hoc. It wasn't done properly at all. So I think what you can conclude about appraisal in New Zealand schools, particularly in secondary schools, is that the main admin processes focused on form filling, tick box. I'm generalising here, some schools I'm sure do it wonderfully well, but as a general rule, and I think despite everything, that we haven't overcome that territoriality and privacy that teachers have. The classroom is my domain, you stay out of that domain, it's mine, I'll do whatever I want. We've still got that. I mean, that is still part and parcel of teaching, despite the fact that we think we're all very collegial about it. Number 17, we're nearly there. And these are big ones, next four big ones. Absence of an aspirational and professional career structure. We don't have a career structure in New Zealand. We don't have one. We have a step-locked salary, which after 8 years says that's as much as you're going to get, unless you want to go and be a DP or unless you want to be head of department. That's 8 years you'll be done. So we reward teaching primarily by experience, irrespective of excellence, and we promote the best out of the classroom. If you want to earn more money, you go and become a senior manager. Okay? What we want is to actually keep our best teachers in the classroom. We don't want them to become headmasters or principals or deputy principals or whatever. We want them in the classroom. So we need an aspirational and a professional career structure that offers salary progression and also more professional working conditions. Some schools are luckier than others, but generally the working conditions are not particularly appealing for top graduates. You need a bit better than that. And at the risk of having a hint of what might be coming up, and also talking about Australia, but they, when I was over there doing some research for the second book, they just introduced a new professional certification system, which was to recognise successful teaching. So their program or their certification had graduate teacher, so that's when you started as a young teacher. Then you became a proficient teacher, and then highly accomplished and a lead teacher. And teachers needed to demonstrate attainment of the standards, because they're all standards-based model, and also to meet the required professional learning. You had to have done some PD and some professional reading as well. And if you attained the highly accomplished and lead teacher status, rather than go and become a headmaster or a principal, then you just stay in the class and get a lot more increased remuneration. They were talking about quite substantial, not just a little bit of a drop, a big jump in terms of remuneration as a highly accomplished or lead teacher. And unlike bonus schemes, it's non-competitive, as it's standards-based. Open to everybody. It's open to everybody. Now, to me, that seemed to have some good sense. Linking performance with certification, with remuneration, and keeping good teachers in the classroom. And that's really what it's all about, I think. So a career structure is something that we desperately need to have a look at. Now, this is where we have some debate on this, I guess, but to me, after reading all this research and having been a teacher for 40 years, you know, it just seems common sense to me that the need to reward the best teachers is both vital and undeniable. Otherwise, you know, we're not going to get the best people going teaching at all. OECD, and this is a 2006 quote, still relevant today, creating a stronger connection between individual teacher contributions and what they are paid lies at the heart of redesigning teaching for the next generation. And it needn't be in a bonus system, it needn't be that competitive. It could be like the Australian system, which I think, if it's implemented well, and there are problems with that at the moment because you've got the federal system, it's not that simple, but I still think that that's something that's got to be done. And Bill Gates, who has given a lot of money to education innovation in the US, said this, and it hits home a little bit. It's astonishing to me to have a system that does not allow us to pay more for someone with scarce abilities, where else would that happen apart from in teaching, that doesn't allow us to pay more for strong performance. It's tantamount to saying that teacher talent and performance don't actually matter. And that's basically saying that students don't matter either. And, you know, it's hard to argue with that. You know, you do pay for scarce abilities. You know, somebody who's a brilliant, brilliant physics teacher, boy, you grab him. And how'd you keep him? You know? Somehow or other, you've got to reward these guys for doing a great job. And rewarding teachers, as I mentioned, the lockstep teacher salary scale is outdated, provides few extrinsic incentives for teachers to show evidence of professional development and improved performance. Don't need to do that. They know that they're going to click up every year, you whip up a bit more money. And there is a war for talent out there. You know, you think about all the professions. Yeah, engineering is now, you know, everybody wants to be an engineer, and we need engineers, for goodness sake, we do. But there's a war for talent. You know, the best and brightest engineering, medicine, and law, and accounting. You know, we, as a profession, if we want to get those people into teaching, then we've got to take on the trappings of a true profession, in which excellence is valued and rewarded. Again, I come back, the government and unions must get together on this. You know, flexibility in teacher employment, that's going to come whether you like it or not, because 21st century education is going to require a different type of skill set and also a different type of organisation, different types of teachers. We're teaching different ways. So we need conditions of flexibility. And we also need a compelling employment brand for teaching. You know, got to get into the teaching. I always remember back in the early 2000s, there was adverts on TV trying to encourage young people into teaching. You probably remember it, some of you. And their strapline, what it was all about was, teaching is fun. Well, you know, it can be fun, but it's not always fun. And there are different ways and better ways of marketing teaching, which I'll come on to very shortly. But you know, telling you teaching is fun is not a compelling employment brand. It doesn't work that way. And also, what we need is some visionary and committed school leaders, because it's up to them to create that inspiring workplace that will keep teachers teaching at your school and not going off somewhere else, disappearing. So it's one way to keep the talented teachers in track there. So, two final things from me. 19th, urgent need to make teaching a career of choice. At the moment, it's not a career of choice for the most talented New Zealand graduates, or in fact for graduates in any country in the world apart from the few that I've mentioned. Again, going back to a survey done in the UK in 2002, and this survey was done with the Russian universities, and it was with the top graduates. And the question was, why don't you even consider going teaching? Why don't you go? And it wasn't to do with money, actually. It was the bottom line, basic reason was they didn't think that teaching was intellectually challenging enough. You know, when they go into a classroom, they've got to look after kids, they've got to be policemen and so on. You know, they weren't actually going to be challenged academically. Interesting point to think about that. You know, teaching's fun. And certainly secondary school students don't perceive it, the top ones. You know, I can quote from my own experience, obviously, but I'm sure there are other heads in the audience today, and you'll know that your top graduates in your 7As and Bs and Cs, they don't go teaching. They don't go teaching. They used to, but they don't go teaching anymore. So to ensure that teaching does become a talent magnet, I think it's got to be a postgrad career, both primary and secondary. At primary, I think it has to be. And we've got to have some primary level specialist teachers trained particularly in maths and science. And finally, the final one thing that I learnt, and Rose learnt I'm sure, is that teaching is a job that smart people do. To quote Dylan William, and I must say that's how he spells his name, it's not a misprint, he's Welsh, and that's the way it works. But the profession needs people drawn to teaching, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And it is a hard profession. We need to market the profession in a challenging and a positive manner. Teaching is at the cutting edge of society's achievements and challenges, which it is. You know, try and get some good, really talented people in there. It's complex, it's demanding, requiring multiple skills and capabilities. Boy, I might be tempted there, a bit of a challenge. It requires intelligent, competent, confident, skilled and enthusiastic young people. That's what teaching requires in the future. If we're going to be up there in that top 5 of the world, which we actually should be, I think we're good enough to be that. As far as my experience and my research would show is that our state school education system is still right up there. But we can do even better. We can do even better. And we hope that in our third book that we can come up with some ideas as to how to show you to do that. Thank you very much.